Well, the collapse of the rock has had a profound impact on the northeast of England and the people who live there. We're going to talk to the panel a little bit further about the psychological impact it had. But Joe Lynham went to listen to their stories.
Newcastle has many symbols of which it is very proud, including its football club and its brown ale. Northern Rock was also one of those symbols. That's why most of the queues outside branches to get money 5 years ago were not to be found here in Newcastle. In short, Northern Rock was more than just a bank. Susan Tron took out one of Northern Rock's infamous 125% Together mortgages. It seems almost laughable now that someone would be offered a loan worth way more than the value of the home they wish to buy. But financial logic was a different country 5 or 10 years ago.
It was like pennies from heaven. He is a 100% mortgage, a little bit of money to get some furniture and a little bit of money to pay all the rest of your debts off. I thought, that's great, that's wonderful. As soon as I got it, I actually realised it wasn't so wonderful because the repayments were massive.
Like many in the northeast, Susan's inscrutable exterior belies a warm humanity. She's dedicated her entire adult life to Stepney Bank's Stables. It's a charity which supports disadvantaged children in the area, and the lion's share of its income comes from the Northern Rock Foundation. But since the demise of the bank, the charity has scaled back radically, and Susan has just been told that she too is being made redundant.
I don't think I've come to terms with it. It's probably a little bit like bereavement. That's the only way I can describe it. When you're in complete shock, I feel really flat. I haven't really thought through what the future holds. I'm sure I'll feel cross, I'll feel excited about new doors opening, but mostly I just feel incredibly sad.
Despite facing her own jobless future, Susan's thoughts turn to those in the area less well off than her.
I get a sense of people still desperately trying to cling on to what they've got, desperately trying to reinvent themselves, desperately trying to fight back. And some of them will be successful, but I do feel there's a sense of incredible sadness as many talents, skills, staff, volunteers, they're just lost forever.
A few miles away in leafier parts, Sylvia Murphy enjoys her retirement on the golf course. She had hoped to have more money to spend in her dotage, and she would have had, but for the scale and speed of Northern Rock's collapse, which caught her and the rest of us by surprise.
I felt let down, and I couldn't believe what was happening. I couldn't believe that the bank was going to collapse.
Sylvia got 1,000 shares from Northern Rock when it transformed itself from being a boring building society into an exciting bank. Those shares, once valued at £12,500, are now worthless, and she blames the former Prime Minister and his Chancellor.
Richard Branson put an offer in, and one other person put an offer in for the bank before it became nationalised. I mean, really, Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling stole my shares.
There's a big gap and areas of immense despair and immense isolation from the national economy, really.
Before being the Bishop of Durham, Justin Welby used to be a derivatives trader. He'll need both experiences as a member of the new Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards set up in the wake of the LIBOR scandal.
Food banks are a relatively new thing. I always associated them with the United States. But we are seeing really significant demand on food banks all over my diocese, all over this area. And particularly in the last 18 months, we're seeing a sharp increase in demand for food banks. The other thing that we are increasingly seeing is demand from people who are working but not earning enough to actually feed the family right the way through the month.
Let's pick up on some of those thoughts. We're back with the panel again. And if I can start with you, Giles Fraser, that phrase that was used, financial logic, was a different country. The days where you borrowed 7 times your salary and you had nothing really to show for it. This idea of progress, that our children would be better off than we are, doesn't exist anymore for a lot of people.
Well, no, and yet people are still... I mean, I still think that sort of optimism and that sort of rather gung-ho thing is still about in the city, which is that I think there's a dangerous thing. I mean, when I was asked to come on this programme, it was 5 years ago. I said, is it really 5 years ago this happened? Because it seemed like it was so recent, because the problems seem to be exactly the same. And I think the problems are that, I mean, and this is as a non-economist, I'm not a specialist, but for people like me, we want to see our banks rooted in some practical reality. And Northern Rock was rooted in the North East, a sort of building society mutual, you understood it. And then suddenly it becomes something virtual. I mean, part of the reason there were so many queues outside Northern Rock, there weren't many branches. And there actually weren't much bricks and mortar to it.
This idea of progress, I mean, does your government now recognise that actually the next generation will be worse off?
I think it depends. These are all, you know, very important policy choices that we have to make. And to go back to the Northern Rock thing again, where was the common sense in government, in the regulators that said mortgages of 125% of somebody's asset are not sensible?
How do the policies fit with what is the reality now?
And again, listening to Mr Darling talking about the fact that wouldn't it be lovely if we could be spending more money on a fiscal stimulus, where does that money come from? Is it right? I know Martin's going to disagree with me because he always does. Is it right to burden the next generation with this generation's debt? It would have been lovely to have money in the bank to do something when this financial crisis hit, but because of the policy decisions of Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown, there was nothing left in the coffers. The coffers were bare. So what are the policy choices? The choices are to make sure that the banking industry is safe and well regulated and taxed, and that people who have missold pensions or fiddled the libel rate are prosecuted, which they can't be done under the current system, and to make sure that that utility works for the benefit of all of us.
We could be sitting here in another 5 years and saying we were only halfway through.
I think that two very quick things. We can grow again. Underlying technology should allow us to grow again. So I don't believe that this generation is definitely going to be poorer than the last one. It might, but that will be the result of mistaken policy decisions. Very bad mistakes. My view, very strongly, is that one of the mistakes in this situation, when it was clear that the private sector was going to retrench for years, is the public sector doesn't. And where's the money going to come from? The government right now can borrow at the lowest rates in the entire history of the United Kingdom. And you're telling me that it can't borrow? It seems to me completely mad.
You would borrow if you could invest in productive assets. And
I would borrow even to spend more on...
to show that the last government borrowed to basically waste.
We've run out of time, but thank you all.